I never thought a simple job would change everything. But when I stepped onto the Winslow estate, I had no idea what I was walking into. It wasn't the kind of place you typically expected a college student like me to find work. The kind of place where the lawns were so perfectly manicured that each blade of grass seemed to have a purpose. But then again, I wasn't in a position to be picky. I was 21, broke, and desperate for a way to pay my tuition. So when I saw the Lawn Help Wanted sign at the Winslow mansion, I couldn't say no. I had heard of Irene Winslow before. The name was almost legendary in Asheville. She was a woman who lived in luxury, someone who held her own in the community. In her early 40s, with a sharp sense of elegance, Irene was everything I wasn't. Yet, when she welcomed me to her estate for the first time, she was warm. Too warm. A little too perfect. It was as though she had rehearsed every interaction, every smile, and every gesture. She made me feel welcome, but I could sense something in the air, a kind of underlying coolness that didn't match her outward friendliness. Her offer was simple: help with the yard work, and I'd be paid handsomely. To someone like me, who lived on instant noodles and coffee, that was a dream come true. And the way she spoke, it wasn't like she needed help. It felt more like a transaction. "Just make sure the garden stays pristine," she told me, her voice smooth, like she was offering me a secret. "I don't mind paying for quality work, and I'm sure you'll be great at it." Her eyes sparkled with something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I found myself agreeing before I even realized it. It was the perfect job, except for one thing: her son, Oliver. He didn't speak to me much at first. I only saw him in passing, tall, broad-shouldered, with tousled brown hair and a smile that seemed to flirt with the corners of his lips. It was hard not to notice him. He was handsome in the way that made him impossible to ignore, but his charm was also paired with a cool, detached demeanor. At first I tried to push him out of my mind. I wasn't here to get distracted. I had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. But that quickly became harder than I expected. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel his gaze following me. Every time I bent down to pull weeds or trimmed the bushes, I could feel his presence lingering nearby. It wasn't that he said anything. It was just the way he looked at me, as if the whole world faded away when his eyes landed on me. And let me tell you, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a normal summer job, but this wasn't about him. It was about me. Now, before we go any further, if you're enjoying the mystery building between Maris and Oliver, stick with me until the end, because you won't believe what happens next. And while you're at it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that leave you breathless. Back to the Winslow estate. Every day, I found myself a little more entranced by the place. The house, with its towering columns and sprawling yard, seemed to have a life of its own. Irene, though distant at times, had an almost hypnotic quality. She was the kind of woman you couldn't quite figure out, always dressed in perfectly tailored outfits, always with a controlled smile on her face. She treated me kindly, but there was something in her eyes that made me wonder if there was more to her than she let on. But Oliver, he was different. He would occasionally walk through the yard, offering to help with things that didn't need help, just for an excuse to be near me. Every smile, every glance seemed to mean something, even though he never said much. His presence made it impossible to focus. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But with every passing day, the tension between us grew, and it became harder to deny that something was happening, something I wasn't prepared for. The Winslow estate had a way of pulling me in, little by little. Every corner of the property seemed to hold something new, something mysterious. The garden, with its vibrant flowers and carefully trimmed hedges, was like a living painting, too perfect to be real. But it wasn't just the beauty of the place that caught my attention. It was the hidden areas, tucked away behind high stone walls or obscured by thick trees. Places that seemed to whisper secrets, begging me to explore them. I found myself wandering through the yard more often than I should have, my hands busy with the work, but my mind lost in the quiet elegance of the estate. There was an air of mystery around the place, like it was too pristine to belong to the real world. I tried not to get too caught up in the allure, but the temptation was always there. The house itself seemed to have a personality, a presence that made it feel like it was watching me. It was on one of those afternoons when I saw him again, Oliver. He was standing by the fence, leaning casually against it, a look of quiet confidence on his face. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. "Hey," he called out, his voice smooth and easy. "How's the work going?" His presence was magnetic, like he had this energy that drew everything towards him. He wasn't just handsome. He had a charm that was almost dangerous, like he knew exactly how to make people pay attention. But I quickly shook myself out of the daze. I was here to work, not to flirt. "Oh, just getting things done," I said, trying to sound casual. He smiled, that same knowing smile that made my heart skip a beat. "I hope you're not working too hard," he said, taking a step closer, his gaze lingering a little too long. "You deserve a break." I nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his stare. There was something in the way he looked at me, like he was seeing more than just the girl working in the yard. But I pushed the thought away. "I'm fine," I said quickly, hoping he couldn't hear the slight tremor in my voice. "I'm just focusing on getting this done." He gave me a knowing look, as though he could see right through me. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing there, heart racing. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. I was here for one reason: money. College wasn't going to pay for itself, and I couldn't afford to get distracted by the handsome, charming son of my employer. But even as I tried to push the thoughts of him out of my mind, I knew it wasn't that simple. The attraction between us was undeniable, simmering just beneath the surface, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel it every time he was around. And the more time I spent at the Winslow estate, the harder it became to stay focused. The house, the garden, the mystery. It was all too much. I didn't know if I was being drawn in by the estate itself, or if it was Oliver's presence that made everything feel so intoxicating. Either way, I was becoming more tangled in it with each passing day. The days blended together as the weeks passed. The Winslow estate became more familiar, and with it, the routine of my work. But despite my efforts to stay focused, something was changing, something I couldn't ignore. Oliver's presence on the property had gone from being a fleeting distraction to a constant reminder of the growing tension between us. At first, he kept his distance, observing from afar, like a silent spectator. But gradually, he started showing up more often. I'd be crouched down, pulling weeds from the flower beds, or trimming the hedges, and then I'd feel it, his eyes on me. I'd glance up and see him standing there, leaning against the fence, or sitting on the steps of the porch, watching me work. It started innocently enough. He'd smile, wave, maybe ask how things were going. He was always polite, but there was something in the way he spoke, something playful that made it hard for me to stay indifferent. I tried to brush it off at first, reminding myself that I was here to earn money, not make friends. But every time he spoke to me, It felt like the space between us shrank just a little more. Then, one afternoon, as I was finishing up around the flower beds, he appeared out of nowhere. "You're working too hard," he said, with that smile of his, stepping closer to where I was kneeling. His voice was light, teasing even. "I could give you a hand, if you need it." I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt off my hands. "I'm fine," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just a little gardening." But he wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his presence filling the air between us. "You're doing a great job," he said. "But you should take a break. I can handle a few of the small tasks." I could feel my pulse quicken. There was no denying it now. He was flirting with me, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. "I'm not here for a break," I said, forcing a laugh. But the words felt weak, even to my own ears. "I'm here to work. The garden doesn't take care of itself." Oliver smiled knowingly, as if he could see right through me. "Fair enough," he said, but I could tell he wasn't going to leave any time soon. And honestly, part of me didn't want him to. He hung around a little longer, leaning against the fence as I continued my work, making occasional comments or offering bits of advice. It was as if he was deliberately trying to keep the conversation going, never letting the silence stretch too long. And with every word, every glance, I felt the distance between us getting smaller. By now, I was beginning to see the pattern. Whenever I worked outside, Oliver would show up, sometimes to offer help, sometimes just to talk. The casual conversations became longer, more frequent. He would ask about my life, about school, and we'd talk about everything from music to the weather. The more we spoke, the more I realized how easy it was to talk to him. It wasn't just his looks that drew me in, but his wit, his effortless charm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a dangerous line. I was here to work. I had a purpose. I couldn't afford to get distracted, not by someone like Oliver. But despite my best intentions, every time he was around, it was hard to think straight. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of work, I was wiping sweat from my brow when I saw him again, strolling casually toward me. I was just finishing up and ready to call it a day. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft, like he was genuinely concerned. He was standing just a few feet away, and the way he looked at me made my heart race. "Just trying to finish before the sun goes down," I said, my voice coming out more breathless than I intended. I couldn't help it. Being so close to him, with his dark eyes fixed on me, was making everything feel different. "You know," he began, his tone playful, "it's okay to take a break once in a while." I shook my head, trying to steady myself. "I can't afford to take breaks," I replied, forcing a smile. "I've got too much to do." Oliver raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "I think you're just being stubborn," he teased. "But I get it. You're a hard worker." I didn't say anything in response. Instead, I focused on packing up my tools, trying to ignore the tension in the air. But Oliver wasn't going anywhere. He stood there watching me, waiting for me to look up. And when I did, there was that smile again, the one that made my stomach flutter. "You know," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "you don't have to do everything alone." It was a simple statement, but the way he said it made my heart skip a beat. There was an invitation in his words, one I couldn't ignore, but I quickly reminded myself that I wasn't here for anything other than the paycheck. I wasn't here to get involved in something complicated. "I'll be fine," I said, my voice firmer now. "Thanks, but no thanks." Oliver didn't press it further. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary, before he finally turned, and walked away. But even as I watched him leave, a part of me couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning. The beginning of something I wasn't sure I was ready for. And no matter how hard I tried to keep my focus on the work, I couldn't deny the fact that the attraction between us was undeniable. And it was growing stronger with each passing day. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the Winslow estate, turning the garden into a peaceful haven of muted light and soft colours. The air was warm, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees as I worked, trying to finish up the extra tasks Irene had left for me. She had mentioned earlier that she'd be out for the evening, leaving me alone on the property. It was rare for the estate to be so quiet, and something about the stillness made me restless. I was pulling weeds from the edge of the garden when I heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind me. I straightened up, wiping a hand across my forehead, and turned to see Oliver standing just a few feet away. His usual easy smile was in place, and for a moment, I couldn't help but feel that familiar flutter in my chest. "Late night?" he asked, his voice warm, the words almost casual, though I could feel something more in the air between us. "Just trying to finish," I replied, trying to sound normal, but my heart was racing. There was something in his gaze, something different tonight. His eyes were darker, more intense, and they seemed to be drawn to me in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Well," he said, stepping closer, his smile softening, "I can't leave you out here all alone." I didn't answer, just shifted my weight, feeling the tension coil between us. The garden, with its lush, overgrown plants and quiet corners, suddenly felt smaller, as if the space around us had been reduced to just the two of us. He was close now, closer than he had ever been before, and I could feel his presence like a heavy weight in the air. There was a moment of silence, the kind that stretched on, thick and heavy. I should have stepped back, should have said something to break the spell, but instead I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away from him. His gaze was unwavering, and before I knew what was happening, he reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against my arm. The touch was gentle, yet it sent a shock through me, as though every nerve in my body was suddenly awake. I felt a surge of electricity rush through my skin, pooling low in my stomach. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for a split second, everything else faded. There were no words, no distractions, just the intensity of that moment, the unspoken understanding that this was more than just a simple touch. Then, without warning, his hand cupped the side of my face, and his lips were on mine. It wasn't slow, nor was it tentative. It was urgent and desperate, as though the tension between us had been building for far too long and couldn't be held back anymore. My hands found their way to his chest, pulling him closer, and I felt the heat of his body pressing against mine. His lips were soft but demanding, kissing me with a fierceness that made my heart race even faster. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just an overwhelming rush of desire. Before I could even process what was happening, I felt his hand slip around my waist, and in one smooth motion, he was guiding me toward one of the secluded corners of the garden. The world outside of this moment ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered was the undeniable need building between us. My mind screamed that this was a mistake, but my body wasn't listening. Every part of me craved him, wanted him, and nothing else seemed to matter in that moment. We didn't speak. There was no need for words. His hands were everywhere, pulling at the fabric of my shirt, urging me to let go, to give in to what we both wanted. I responded in kind, my fingers finding the buttons of his shirt, and in a matter of seconds, the barrier of clothing between us was gone. The cool air of the evening contrasted with the heat of our skin as we found a quiet spot in the garden, surrounded by tall, thick bushes that shielded us from the world. The space felt like our own private universe, and in that space, nothing existed except for the wild electric connection between us. As we came together, the world outside seemed to disappear entirely. There were no distractions, no responsibilities, just the two of us, lost in a frenzy of passion. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sensations of him against me, his lips on my skin, his touch igniting every inch of my body. It was like a release, a surrender I hadn't even known I needed. The sound of our breathing, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the faint hum of distant night noises were the only things that filled the air. And then, as everything built to a crescendo, it was over. The intensity of the moment left us both breathless, our bodies still tangled together, hearts pounding in sync. We didn't speak afterward. There was no need. In the silence that followed, it was as if the world had returned to its place, and everything outside of that garden corner came rushing back. I could feel the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air, but neither of us said a word. It wasn't an apology, nor an explanation. It was simply the end of that moment, a moment we both knew could never be erased. The next morning, when I woke up and the sun's light began to stream through the window, there was no mention of what had happened. It was as if it had never occurred, like a fleeting dream that disappeared as soon as the light hit. Oliver was nowhere to be found when I finished my work, and Irene didn't return until late in the day. It was as if the events of the night before had been suspended in time, neither of us acknowledging it, neither of us addressing it. It was as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The days after that night seemed to stretch on, each one feeling like it carried the weight of something unspoken, a secret neither Oliver nor I was willing to acknowledge. The air around the Winslow estate was thick with tension. An unspoken barrier had settled between us, though neither of us spoke of it. Instead, we moved through our daily routines, careful not to bring attention to the things we both knew had changed. Irene, however, was a different story. She'd always been distant in a way, wrapped up in her own world of elegance and sophistication. But now, her behaviour seemed colder, more detached. At first I thought it was just me, that perhaps I was being paranoid after what had happened with Oliver. But as the days wore on, it became impossible to ignore. Irene's usual warmth toward me seemed to have evaporated. She hardly made small talk, and when she did speak, it felt forced, like she was saying things she didn't really mean. There were moments when I caught her staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl, a look that wasn't just cold, but full of something darker. Suspicion, maybe, or even resentment. It was as though she knew something, but she wasn't ready to confront it yet. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. My thoughts were always muddled, split between the undeniable pull I still felt toward Oliver and the growing unease surrounding Irene. One afternoon, after Irene had left for a meeting, I found myself in the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. I had no real reason for being there, other than the fact that I needed a break from the yard work. But as I turned to leave, I heard her voice coming from the other room, her tone sharp, her words clipped. Curiosity got the better of me, and I lingered trying to make out what she was saying. "I told you, you need to keep it hidden." Irene's voice rang through the hall, her words piercing the quiet house. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I didn't know who she was talking to, but the intensity of her words sent a chill down my spine. The phrase, "keep it hidden," echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with what had happened between Oliver and me. Had she somehow found out? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help myself. I strained to listen, hoping to catch more of the conversation. The voice on the other end of the line was muffled, but Irene's responses were clear, her irritation rising with each passing second. "We can't let anyone find out about this," she continued, her voice tight with frustration. "It's not just about the family anymore. You have to understand that." My heart pounded in my chest. Family? Was she talking about Oliver? Or was there something deeper going on here, something more sinister than I could imagine? I stepped away from the door, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The last thing I wanted was to get caught eavesdropping, but the conversation had left me unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that Irene was hiding something that might change everything for me. As I made my way back to the garden, I forced myself to focus on my work. The weeds needed pulling, the flowers needed tending, and I had a job to do. But my mind kept drifting back to what I'd overheard. What could Irene possibly be keeping hidden? And what did it have to do with me, or Oliver, for that matter? Every time I looked up, I half expected Irene to be watching me, her eyes filled with judgment or something darker. But she wasn't around much. She spent more time in her study or out of the house entirely. I couldn't help but wonder if she was avoiding me. But why? I had enough to worry about without adding Irene's strange behavior to the mix. My attraction to Oliver was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, making it impossible to focus on anything else. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't let myself get lost in those feelings, not when everything else was so uncertain. The distance between me and Irene grew, and I couldn't ignore it. She was keeping something from me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just ignore the warning signs. Something was off, and it felt like the walls around me were slowly closing in. I couldn't afford to lose this job. College was expensive, and the money Irene was paying me was a lifeline. I needed the work, needed the stability. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. The secret Irene was hiding, whatever it was starting to affect everything. For the rest of the week, I tried my best to stay focused on the task at hand, but my mind kept wandering. I kept looking for clues, trying to piece together what was really going on. And as the days dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to understand. It had been an entire week since that night, the night everything between Oliver and me changed. The lingering heat of what we shared still burned in the back of my mind. But I told myself I needed to focus on the things that mattered, like my studies and keeping my job. The Winslow estate, though beautiful and serene, had become a place of tension, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Irene's behavior grew more erratic, and every time I crossed paths with Oliver, it felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one wrong step away from tumbling into the unknown. We spoke less, and when we did, the conversation was always casual, keeping the awkwardness at bay. Yet, underneath it all, there was an undeniable pull, a magnetic force I couldn't escape. That afternoon, I was kneeling by the flower beds, my hands buried in the rich soil, trying to focus on anything other than the thoughts swirling in my head. The sun was warm on my back, and the soft hum of the estate surrounded me, a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing inside. I had almost convinced myself that things between Oliver and me could stay untouched, that I could keep everything under control. But then, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't have to look up to know it was him. Maris. Oliver's voice was soft but steady. There was something in it that made my pulse quicken, an edge to it that told me this wasn't going to be another casual exchange. I turned slowly to face him, wiping my hands on my jeans. He stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. His usual easy smile was gone, replaced with something more serious, something that made the air between us feel heavy. "Can we talk?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine with a kind of intensity that took me off guard. I nodded, unsure of what to expect, but knowing that avoiding this conversation wouldn't make it go away. As we walked towards the far end of the garden, where the hedges shielded us from the main house, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his presence. Oliver was always so confident, so composed, but today he seemed different. We stopped in front of a small bench, and Oliver sat down first, motioning for me to join him. Hesitantly, I sat beside him, our bodies just a few inches apart, but feeling like miles. The air between us was thick with things unsaid, with emotions neither of us were ready to face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint rustle of the trees in the distance, the chirp of birds, but everything felt distant. Finally, Oliver broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know I'm not supposed to say this, but I can't help it anymore." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground, before meeting my eyes again. "Maris, I've been feeling this way for a long time. Even before that night, I've wanted this. Wanted you." My heart skipped a beat at his words. I had thought about that night endlessly, replaying it in my mind, but hearing him speak it aloud, admit it, sent a rush of conflicting emotions flooding through me. I wasn't sure how to respond. What did he mean by this? Did he expect something more from me? Was this something we could even talk about without it becoming complicated? He exhaled deeply, as though the weight of his confession had been pressing down on him for longer than he could bear. "I know what we did was impulsive," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "It was a moment of weakness for both of us, but I'm not sorry about it. Not really." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for some sort of response. I didn't know how to react. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, surprise, confusion, and a deep sense of unease. The tension of that night still simmered within me, and hearing him admit that he'd been feeling this way for so long made everything even more real. "I didn't expect this," I finally managed to say, my voice quieter than I intended. "I never planned for any of this to happen." I paused, trying to find the right words. "And I still don't know what it means. I never thought I'd be in this position." Oliver's expression softened, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "I get it," he said, his tone gentle now. "I didn't mean to complicate things for you. You have your life, your goals, and I respect that. But I had to tell you how I feel. I can't just keep pretending like nothing happened between us." He gave me a small smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Maris. I wanted you to know the truth." A heavy silence hung between us. I felt torn between the desire that still pulsed in my veins whenever I was near him and the reality of my life outside this estate. I had dreams, goals I couldn't afford to sacrifice. And yet, there was something undeniable in the way Oliver looked at me, in the way he spoke to me now. It was as if all the walls we had built were crumbling, and I was standing at the edge of something I wasn't ready to dive into. "I don't know what to do with this," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the vulnerability in it unmistakable. I'm just trying to figure out my life right now. Oliver nodded, his face filled with understanding. I know. I'm not asking for anything, Maris. I just needed to say it. He stood up then, giving me a final, lingering look before turning away. I won't say anything more. But I'll be here, if you ever need to talk. As he walked back toward the house, I stayed seated on the bench, my mind racing. His words echoed in my ears, and I couldn't help but wonder, what now? The days that followed Oliver's confession felt heavier than ever. His words echoed in my mind at every quiet moment, every task I worked through at the Winslow estate. It was as if everything in my life had suddenly been tossed up in the air, and I wasn't sure which way it was going to land. I had always prided myself on being focused, on my goals, my studies, my future. But now, with the weight of Oliver's feelings pressing on me, I found it harder and harder to keep my gaze fixed on the path ahead. I had a job to finish, tuition to pay, and a future to build. But the pull of him, the way his eyes followed me when I worked, the small, meaningful exchanges we shared, they were becoming impossible to ignore. The attraction was undeniable. It was like a magnet that pulled me in closer every time we crossed paths, despite my best efforts to keep things professional. I tried to distance myself, kept my head down, and focused on my work. But every time I saw him, every time his voice broke the silence of the estate, my heart would flutter, and my resolve would slip away. It wasn't just physical. There was something more. Something deeper in the way he made me feel seen. I felt alive when he was near, caught in a storm of emotions I didn't know how to control. But then, my mind would snap back to reality. I couldn't afford to lose sight of what was important. I had come to this job for a reason. I had come to save up for my education, for the future I dreamed of. I couldn't let a momentary distraction cloud that. I couldn't let him ruin everything I'd worked for. Still, the more I tried to ignore him, the more impossible it became. Every glance, every soft word, every fleeting touch left me wanting more, even though I knew I shouldn't want it. I was torn between two worlds, the world of responsibility and dreams, and the world of undeniable attraction and temptation. Both seemed to call to me, and I didn't know which one to choose. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, the night we crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. I had never been one to act on impulse, but when Oliver kissed me, when his hands touched me, it felt like something I couldn't undo, something I didn't want to undo. It was a moment of weakness, sure, but it was also a moment of freedom. And now, I was left questioning whether I could ever go back to being just the girl who worked on the Winslow estate. Was I still that person? Or had I become someone else entirely? Someone caught between desires and responsibilities? Irene's strange behaviour only made things worse. She was distant, colder than before, and every time she spoke to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she wasn't saying. I had overheard the phone conversation, the cryptic words that seemed to hint at secrets I couldn't even begin to understand. But did I want to get involved in whatever she was hiding? Was it worth risking everything, my job, my relationship with her, and my own peace of mind? The problem was, I didn't have answers. I only had more questions, more uncertainty. And with every passing day, I felt more and more like I was walking a tightrope, trying to balance my future with my feelings. Could I focus on my education while this tension with Oliver simmered just beneath the surface? Could I push him away, force myself to see him only as the charming, distant son of my employer? Or was I already too far gone? I didn't know if I was strong enough to make the right decision, but I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. And soon. I couldn't let myself fall deeper into a situation I knew would only end in heartbreak. I needed to find a way to regain control before it was too late. But what was the right choice? Should I focus on my future and let go of my feelings for Oliver? Or should I follow my heart, even if it meant throwing everything I had worked for into jeopardy? The truth was, I wasn't sure I could do either, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, pulled between two worlds, unable to choose. The choice, whether I liked it or not, was coming, and it was one I would have to make. I couldn't keep running from the truth anymore. The tension had been building inside me for weeks, each passing day heavier than the last. My emotions were a tangled mess, and the uncertainty gnawed at me like a constant ache. I knew something wasn't right, both with Irene and with Oliver. The strange distance between me and Irene, the unsettling feeling that something was being hidden from me. It had all started to feel like too much to ignore. The decision I had been avoiding for so long now felt unavoidable. I had to confront Irene. I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel the pull between me and her son, especially when my entire world felt like it was unraveling. It was time to face whatever she had been hiding, whatever secret was lurking in the shadows of the Winslow estate. I had been working on the garden that morning, pulling weeds and tending to the flower beds, when I saw Irene walking toward me from the house. She looked more composed than usual, but I could tell something was different. Her eyes seemed sharper, colder, as though she had been steeling herself for this conversation too. As she reached me, I put down the garden shears, wiping my hands on the edge of my apron. My heart raced, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. "I need to talk to you, Irene," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's something going on. I can't keep pretending. I don't know." Irene paused, her gaze softening for a moment, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She exhaled slowly, like she had been holding her breath for a long time. Then, without another word, she motioned for me to follow her toward the back porch. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the estate around us doing little to calm the storm brewing inside me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my thoughts racing faster than I could keep up. I needed to know. I needed to understand why everything between Irene and Oliver felt so off. Finally, Irene spoke. "I've been meaning to talk to you about this, Maris." Her voice was low, cautious, as though she wasn't sure how much to reveal. She paused, her hands folded in her lap as she stared down at them, as if the words were hard to get out. I leaned forward, my stomach in knots. "What's going on between you and Oliver? It's different. There's something you're not telling me." Her eyes flickered up to mine, a mixture of sadness and resignation clouding her expression. "You're right," she said quietly. "There's a lot more to our story than you realize. Oliver and we've been through things I wish I could change. Our relationship, it's complicated, and it's always been that way." I stayed silent, unsure of what to say, but urging her to continue with my eyes. "I never meant for you to get caught up in it," Irene continued, her voice tinged with regret. "But when Oliver saw you, when he started talking to you, I could see it, the way he looked at you, the way he would act around you. It's something I know all too well." I could feel the tension in the air growing thicker as Irene's words started to sink in. I had been so focused on my own feelings, on the attraction I couldn't deny, that I hadn't thought much about the deeper, more complicated history between Irene and Oliver. "Oliver and I had a difficult past," Irene said, her voice softer now, as though she were letting me in on a secret she had buried long ago. We were close, too close for comfort at times, but we were also incredibly toxic for each other. There was so much hurt, so much love and resentment mixed together, and it ended in a way neither of us could fully come to terms with. The scars are still there, and I'm afraid they always will be. I couldn't stop myself from asking, does he know how you feel about him? Does he understand why you're like this with him? Irene looked away, her expression pained. I've tried to make him understand, but sometimes people can't change. He's not the same person he was back then, but there's a part of him that never really healed. And now you're here, and I can see him falling for you in the same way he did before. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I mean, she said, her gaze finally meeting mine with a mixture of warning and sorrow. You need to be careful with him, Maris. He's charming. Yes, he's beautiful, and he knows how to make you feel special. But that's only part of the story. The other part, the part that you'll only see once you're too deep, is the damage he's carrying. The damage I couldn't fix, no matter how hard I tried. I felt a cold shiver run through me. Her words hung in the air like a threat I hadn't been ready for. But despite the warning, something in me refused to back away from him. The bond between us, however complicated it was real, undeniable. I'm not trying to scare you, Irene added, her voice breaking. I just want you to understand. He may love you now, but he doesn't always know how to handle that love. And it can be dangerous. I didn't respond right away. I was too lost in the weight of her words, too caught up in the pull of Oliver's presence, to know what to say. The truth hung between us, and I knew I had to make a choice. Whether to walk away and preserve my future, or take the risk of getting lost in something that could tear it all apart. But despite everything Irene had said, despite the warnings, one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore how I felt. 9. The final decision. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind, each moment stretching out as I tried to find my footing. Irene's warning echoed in my mind, but it wasn't just her words that weighed on me. It was the tug of war between my heart and my head. The part of me that ached for Oliver, and the part that knew I couldn't let this distraction derail everything I had worked for. I spent countless nights lying awake, replaying the moments I had shared with him, the stolen glances, the quiet moments, the intense connection that felt so real. But as much as I cared for him, I couldn't ignore the bigger picture. I had come too far to let a relationship with him, however powerful it felt in the moment, threaten my future. I knew what I had to do. I found him one afternoon by the garden, the place where so many of our conversations had begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over everything. But the warmth it provided wasn't enough to ease the tension in my chest. My heart pounded, the reality of what I was about to say sinking in. Oliver, I began, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm brewing inside me. We need to talk. He turned to face me, that same familiar smile on his face, though there was a question in his eyes. I could tell he'd been hoping for a different conversation. I wished I could have given him one. But the words that followed were the ones I knew I had to say. I can't keep doing this, I continued. I know we've shared something special, but I need to focus on myself. I have my education, my career, things I've worked hard for, and I can't afford to let anything or anyone get in the way of that. I'm sorry, but I can't continue this with you. There it was. The truth, raw and unfiltered. The weight of the decision settled over me, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his eyes searching mine. I could see the disappointment there. The understanding mingled with the hurt. My heart twisted, but I had no choice. I had to choose me. I get it, he said quietly, after a long pause. I won't push you. I respect your decision, Maris. You've got your life ahead of you. And I don't want to be the thing that holds you back. His words were calm, even though I could see the pain in his eyes. I felt a pang in my chest, but I knew I had made the right choice. We didn't say much more after that, but the air between us felt lighter, as though the decision had cleared a path for both of us to move forward, even if it was separately. As I walked away from him that day, a strange sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't easy, nothing about it had been. But I was finally free from the weight of indecision, free from the turmoil of wondering whether I was making the wrong choice. I packed my things, said my goodbyes, and left the Winslow estate. It felt like stepping into a new chapter, one that was mine to write. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider before. Oliver and I may have shared something special, but the truth was, my journey was only just beginning. I had goals, dreams, and a life that needed to be shaped by my own hands, not by the complications of a relationship that was never meant to be. As I moved forward, I carried with me the lessons I had learned, about love, about myself, and about the importance of staying true to my own path. The choices I made now would shape my destiny, and I was determined to make them count. With each step I took away from the estate, I felt lighter, more confident in the direction I was heading. And though part of me would always remember Oliver and the moments we shared, I knew deep down that my future, my real future, was waiting for me, and it was time to embrace it. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep the stories coming. If you want to show extra love and support, you can donate through Super Thanks or consider joining the channel for exclusive content and behind-the-scenes updates. Your contribution helps make these stories possible. Thank you for being a part of this journey. See you in the next story.